Hello and welcome to this revision resource for JB Priestley's Inspector Calls. As normal, we're going to look at the two things you're assessed for, that is AO1, understanding what the play is about, its themes and its ideas, and AO2, its language, form and structure. Today's video is going to focus on Eva Smith, or as she becomes known, Daisy Renton. As normal, we're going to start by looking at stage direction. Well, Priestley sets his audience up to work out the mystery of Eva Smith. We are never given a description of her by Priestley, instead relying on, well, perhaps unreliable narrators, the Burlings and of course the inspector himself. From their descriptions, we are repeatedly told that she is pretty, and that she has brown hair and brown eyes, to suggest that she doesn't stand out from the crowd, yet she's also something that'd be wrong or unpleasant to destroy. Some notes then on Eva Smith herself. She's symbolic of the workers at the time. She is a vulnerable character who is able to be exploited by each of the Burlings. We're told that she's hard-working, in fact almost management material if she was able to keep a job long enough. She's underpaid for what she does. She's got a realistic view of life, and she has a really high set of moral values. The name of the girl who committed suicide is really important. Many writers tend to think about the names they give their characters to best represent some of the things they symbolise. Eva Smith is the first name we get told she uses. Eva is symbolic of Eve. This is used to represent her purity and her innocence, as well as her importance in the play. Smith is the most common surname in England at the time the play was written. This suggests she's like everyone else and represents the masses, not just one person. As we know though, she changes her name to Daisy Renton. Daisy is a common but pretty flower, and Renton suggests the life she is reduced to, a girl for rent. Now for higher grades, we might actually plot how her name changes throughout the text. She starts off as Eva, the perfect woman, uncorrupted, innocent, unique and perfect, God's creation. The surname Smith represents a common woman, symbolic of what women stand for in 1912. This then changes to Daisy, a pretty common flower, but now an object rather than a person. Renton, a word that implies for sale, cheap and used, further objectifying than Eva Smith. And then lastly, she uses the name Mrs. Burling, suggests that because of the abuse she's suffered from the Burlings, she is now lower than an object, perhaps easier identifying than Priestley's intentions for our own reaction to Mrs. Burling herself, perhaps arguably the worst of the characters. As normal, when studying this play, it's always a good idea to look at whether a character is capitalist or socialist. If you're unsure what those two words mean, please pause the video now and take a look at some of the bullet points on the board. Eva Smith represents the effect of industrialization as the rich got richer and the poor slowly lost their jobs. She represents the rise of the suffragette movement, more on that later, and the threat to the patriarchy, which is male-dominated society. She represents the exploitation of the lower class, and women in particular. And of course she represents the everyday worker of 1912. Further ideas might be gleaned from the fact that Eve, or Eva, represents the original woman, the original family, in fact, God's creations. They were the original form of equality, and so socialism. If we follow this analogy through, each of the Burlings poisons Eva into a lower form, forcing her to choose between what she believes is morally right and their capitalist world. Each time she chooses morally right, the morally right path, but suffers for it. As already stated, Eva has to make choices, but so do each of the Burlings. They get chance after chance to do the right thing, and each time they fail. In many respects, Eva is their moral compass, but they keep failing to make the right choice.
Should you or shouldn't you? The hardest morality test ever. Some choices are pretty easy. Coffee or tea, fries or onion rings, boxers or briefs. Others, however, are so hard that they seem almost impossible to make. We're specifically talking about moral dilemmas here, when both options just seem so unfair or undesirable, but something's got to be done. So get ready and calibrate your moral compass, because we've prepared the hardest test ever. It's full of moral dilemmas, and the way you solve them can speak volumes about your personality.
Perhaps that clip would serve as a really good introduction to the play itself. Now, as you've probably seen many of my other clips, we've talked about the burnings representing different sins. Well, Eva might be suggested to hold many of the 7 heavenly virtues. If you read Inspector Calls as a biblical text, Eva represents all 7 of these virtues, but the Burlings try and steal each one from her, one by one. Let's remind ourselves then of the social responsibility each of the Burlings have.
We employers at last are coming together to see that our interests and the interests of capital are properly protected. And we're in for a time of steadily increasing prosperity.
On the night the inspector calls, the Burlings are celebrating Sheila and Gerald's engagement. A jovial Arthur Burling speaks freely of his wealth and good fortune.
I don't want to lecture you two young fellows again, but what so many of you don't seem to understand is that now things are so much easier, a man has to make his own way. He has to look after himself, and his family too, of course, when he has one. And so long as he does that, he won't come to much harm.
Priestley's socialist views embraced the sharing of wealth and responsibility. People needed to work together as a community and look after one another. The rich, for instance, could help the poor by paying higher taxes. Arthur Burling's ideology is the opposite of Priestley's. He's a staunch capitalist and isn't afraid to sing the praises of greed and self-preservation.
But the way some of these cranks talk and write now, you'd think that everybody has to look after everybody else, eh? As if we were all mixed up together like bees in a hive. Community and all that nonsense. But take my word for it, you youngsters, I have learned in the good hard school of experience that a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own. And then, I wonder who that can be.
The inspector arrives bearing news of Eva Smith's suicide, which further exposes the Burlings' selfish behaviour and sense of entitlement. For the first time, they are made to realise that their actions have consequences. In the interests of preserving profits, Arthur Burling refused Eva a pay increase. Sheila had her fired because Eva hurt her vanity. Gerald took her as his mistress out of lust, while Eric
just used her for the end of a stupid drunken evening, as if she was an animal, a thing, not a person.
Pregnant with Eric's child, Eva was denied assistance by the women's charity organisation thanks to Sybil Burling.
Was it owing to your influence as the most prominent member of the committee that help was refused the girl?
Possibly.
Was it, or was it not, your influence?
I didn't like her manner. She'd impertinently made use of our name, though pretended afterwards it happened to be the first she'd thought of. She had to admit, after I began questioning her, that she had no claim to the name, that she wasn't married, and that the story she'd told at first about her husband who deserted her was quite false.
Priestley publicly supported the formation of the National Health Service, a healthcare system designed to provide equal access for everyone to medical and health services, including the country's underprivileged. He observed that charities were often run by wealthy people like Sybil Burling, who had no personal experience of poverty and desperation.
Let's take a closer look then at Eva Smith's timeline. The play itself is plotted around 2 years long, so we look at 2 years of Eva Smith's life. She worked at Burling & Co. until September 1910. She's working class and takes a job at Millward's in December 1910. She's fired in January 1911, meets Gerald in March 1911. Gerald breaks up with her in September 1911. She loves Gerald but knows it won't last. She goes away until November 1911 when she meets Eric. Discovers she's pregnant in December 1911. Breaks up with Eric in March 1912 and visits Mrs. Burling in late March 1912. By April, she has of course committed suicide, around about the same time as in fact the Titanic sunk. Priestley has observed the 3 unities of classical Greek drama, which help create a sense of mystery regarding Eva's death. This involves then the unity of place, the location in the play remains the same. The unity of time, stage time and real time, are in fact identical. Unity of action, as the play only has one main plot. And the inspector is like a chorus in a Greek play, as everything that happens to Eva Smith is reported and happens off stage. He sums up what has happened, comments on the characters and explains the lessons to be learnt for the audience. The breaks between the acts are not meant to disturb the action to make it convincing and realistic. Some theatres even perform it without an interval at all. Let's have a look then at the key moments in Act 1. We learn that a woman died in the infirmary after swallowing disinfectant. She died in agony, and it was suicide. She left a diary of her life. The inspector shows a picture of Eva to Mr. Burling. We learn she was 24, worked at Mr. Burling's works, and led a strike in September 1910. She was a good worker. Eva was fired from her lead role in that strike. We find out she was pretty. Eva was then out of work for 2 months. Her parents were dead, but she got very lucky and got a job at Millward's. Sheila then got her fired at Millward's, but Eva never discovered why. And Eva Smith changed her name to Daisy Renton. Let's join then the inspector as he visits the Burlings and begins to recount the sorry tale of Eva's life.
2 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. She was taken there this afternoon after swallowing quite a lot of strong disinfectant. Burnt her inside out, of course.
My God.
Yes, she was in great agony. They did what they could for her at the infirmary, but she died. Suicide, of course.
Yes, horrible business. But I don't see why you should come here to see me, Inspector.
Well, I went round to the room that she had, and she'd left a letter and a sort of diary. Now, like a lot of these young women who get themselves into all sorts of trouble, she'd used more than one name. But her original name, her real name, was Eva Smith.
Eva Smith?
Do you remember her at all, Mr. Burling?
Let's look closer at some of the key moments in Act 1. I'd like some information if you don't mind, Mr. Burling. 2 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. She'd been taken there this afternoon because she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant. Burnt her inside out, of course. Oh my God. Yes, she was in great agony. They did everything they could for her at the infirmary, but she died. Suicide, of course. Yes, horrible business. But I don't understand why she'd come here, Inspector. I've been around the room she had. and she left a letter there in a sort of diary. Like a lot of these women who get into various kinds of trouble, she used more than one name. Her original name, her real name, was Eva Smith. Do you remember Eva Smith? Do you remember her, Mr. Burling? No. I seem to remember hearing that name, Eva Smith, somewhere, but it doesn't convey anything to me. I don't see where I come into this. The inspector's language here is respectful and courteous. He lulls the Burlings into a sense of security, a marked contrast to his later way of speaking by the end of the play. Immediately, the language used is graphic to describe her death and designed to cause empathy in the audience. Burling's language and repetition here is deliberately uncaring and informal. Yes, yes, he says, almost dismissing the suicide entirely. The inspector's forcefulness and need to teach a lesson is first seen here when he cuts into Mr. Burling, interrupting him. Not something, of course, Mr. Burling would be used to. This is a reaction to Mr. Burling's passivity, or perceived passivity, towards Eva Smith's death. The pauses here build up tension to reveal a name that Arthur recognises. And now let's look at some key quotes from Act 1. We're given some quite grisly details of her death. The Burling's lack of empathy is clear in the words used by Arthur. And we're also reminded she is pretty, very pretty, by the inspector. Finally, we find out she was lonely, half-starved. She was feeling desperate. The quote at the bottom right reveals a tricolon there. In fact, more than a tricolon, a list describing then all the things she was suffering from by the time she committed suicide. Eva Smith's behaviour and actions in the workhouse echo the beginning of the suffragette movement. Eva symbolises the way women were treated in industrial Britain.
Women should not exercise judgment in political affairs.
If we allow women to vote, it will mean the loss of social structure.
Vote for women! Vote for women! Vote for women! I'm not.
You work at the laundry?
Part-time from when I was 7, full-time from when I was 12.
We meet Mondays and Thursdays if you're interested.
You're a suffragette, Mrs. Elliot.
I consider myself more of a soldier. As Mrs. Pankhurst says, it's deeds, not words, that will get us the vote.
We've identified weaknesses in their ranks. We're hoping one of them will break.
They're saying she's to speak.
This is a deliberate escalation. This has to stop.
For 50 years, we have laboured peacefully to secure the vote for women. We've been ridiculed, battered, and ignored.
Punish those responsible, whatever way you can.
Mama!
All my life, I've done what men told me. Well, I can't have that anymore.
Took my love, took it down.
I incite the women in Britain to rebellion.
Can I sail through the changing ocean tides? Can I handle the seasons of my life?
We break windows. We burn things, because war's the only language men listen to.
Well, I've been afraid of changing.
There's nothing left but to stop you.
We're in every home. We're half the human race. You can't stop us all.
Time makes you bolder, even
You might lose your life before this is over.
I'm getting older too.
We will win.
I take my love, take it down.
Never surrender. Never give up the fight.
In the snow-covered hill.
Perhaps that's why Priestley sets Eva up to be working in a workhouse right at the start of the play. Eva's life and subsequent death hangs over every page of the play. Priestley constructs a victim who is forward-thinking, an innocent woman, striving to be thought of as an equal in the capitalist world of 1912. Unfortunately, that same capitalist world of 1912 punishes her for it.
Eyes front! Eyes front!
Hunger strike. Was standing by my window on a cold and cloudy day.
Quiet!
When I saw that hearse come rolling for to carry my mother away, will the circle be unbroken?
Get her out of here.
By and by, Lord, by and by, there's a better home awaiting in the sky, Lord, in the sky. Lord, I told that undertaker, please drive slow, for this body you are hauling. Lord, I hate to see her go. Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by? There's a better home awaiting in the sky, Lord, in the sky. I will follow close behind her, try to roll up and be brave, but I could not hide my sorrow when they laid her in the grave. Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by? There's a better home awaiting in the sky, Lord, in the sky.
As we know, there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths. Priestley implies the tide of change is unstoppable. The capitalists may kill one girl, but the others will rise up and take her place. Eva's suicide is tragic. She knew that, as a working woman, her life expectancy probably wouldn't have been above 40. Eva had been abused and used throughout her life and seemingly raped by Eric. This act, or one like it, led to her pregnancy. She cannot bear the thought of bearing a child in these circumstances. Times have not changed all that much.
An urgent review of the way victims and witnesses of abuse should be treated has now been ordered. This after a woman took her own life when the man she'd accused of rape was acquitted. Tracy Shelby threw herself off a roof in Rochdale days after the verdict. The Greater Manchester Police Commissioner Tony Lloyd described the court process as brutal and said that many rape victims described going through it as being as traumatic as their original ordeal. Our Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel has this report.
This was Tracy Shelby's home in Rochdale. It's where police came last Friday to break the news. The man she'd accused of rape had been acquitted. Behind the boarded-up windows, she pondered her fate. Giving evidence in 2 trials was not enough. This highly vulnerable woman was left angry and upset, despite the efforts of support agencies. The 41-year-old mother, in a moment of desperation, came here yesterday morning, 2 miles from her home. Police officers spent some time trying to talk her down from the top of that car park. But the impact of her ordeal at the hands of the criminal justice system proved too great to overcome.
Through Eva, we are shown the corruption of a young woman by the patriarchy, that is, the male-dominated society. This is a savage portrayal of the middle and upper class men and their metaphorical and physical rape of the working class. This event is mentioned last, that is, Eric's rape of Eva, is mentioned last as Priestley would need to prepare the audience for this awful realisation. As the narrative evolves, we grow to understand Eva and her life. She becomes less just a body on a slab, and more of a living, breathing person. Priestley presents Eva's fall from grace by subtly implying vices such as drink are taking her life. She is juxtaposed with Gentleman Gerald, her prince. This adds a historical element to the character. She symbolises the way women have always been treated for generations. That is, controlled by men and manipulated by men. Let's look at the key ideas then behind Act 2. We find out Eva enjoyed life, and we are given further details about her looks. The local alderman attempted to molest her. An alderman is an elected member of the local council. She needed help, and Gerald swooped in and saved her. He took advantage of her need for food and money. She was grateful. After Gerald's affair, she goes to the seaside for 2 months to remember him. And she returns and appears to go straight to Mrs. Burling's charity for help. She is refused. Let's watch then as Gerald recaps some of the details about her.
But then I noticed this girl was completely different. She's very pretty. Soft brown hair and big dark eyes. God.
What's the matter?
No, I'm sorry, I suddenly realized, taken it in properly, she's dead.
Yes. She's dead. Go on.
She was young and fresh, charming, completely out of place down there. But obviously she wasn't enjoying herself. Old Joe Meggerty, half drunk and goggle-eyed, and wedged her into a corner with that obscene fat carcass.
Surely you don't mean Alderman Meggerty?
But of course I do. He's a notorious womanizer, as well as being one of the worst sots and rogues in Brumley.
That's quite right.
Well, really, Alderman Meggerty. I must say we are learning something tonight.
Go on, please.
Well, the girl saw me looking at her and gave me a glance that could only have been a cry for help. So, I went across to Meggerty and made up some nonsense about the manager having a message for him or something like that, and got him out of the way. And then I told the girl that if she didn't want anything more like that sort of thing, she must let me take her out of there. Well, she agreed at once.
Let's take a closer look at some of the key ideas then, or key pages of Act 2. I didn't intend to stay down there long. I hated those hard-eyed, dough-faced women. Then I noticed a girl who looked quite different. She was very pretty. Soft brown hair and big dark eyes. My God. What's the matter? Sorry. I suddenly realised, taken it in properly, that she's dead. Yes, she's dead. Go on. The girl was charmingly dressed too, in a simple, inexpensive sort of way, and altogether she looked young and fresh and charming, and, what shall I say, the opposite of hard and tough, unable to look after herself. She was quite out of place down there, and obviously she wasn't enjoying herself. Old Joe Meggerty, half drunk and goggle-eyed, had wedged her into a corner with that obscene fat carcass of his. There's no need to be disgusting. Surely you don't mean Alderman Meggerty? Of course I do. He's a notorious womanizer and one of the worst sots and rogues in Brumley. Well, really, Alderman Meggerty? Well, we are learning something tonight. Of course we are, and everyone knows about that horrible old Meggerty. A girl I know had to see him at the town hall one afternoon, and she only escaped with a torn blouse. Sheila. Go on. This girl saw me looking at her, and then she gave me a glance, obviously an SOS. Gerald's language here emphasises her youth and vulnerability. Gerald contrasts her with the hard women, implying she was soft, an easy target. Gerald's language here exaggerates the virtues he wants to take from her youth, her freshness, and her charm. The situation Eva is placed in here, wedged into a corner between old Joe Meggerty and, of course, Gerald, gives her a no-win situation. Be taken by the alderman, who is obscene or vile, or the suave manipulating Gerald. Once more, at the end of this page, we are invited to see her as Eva as innocent and young. We view the situation through Gerald's eyes, as he hopes to be a hero. His upper-class worldview automatically translates his actions as being in the right. Page 2 then, from Act 2. Did she drink that much at the time? No, she only had a port and lemonade, or some such concoction. All she wanted to do was talk, a little friendliness, and I gathered that Joe Meggerty's advances had left her rather shaken, as well they might. She talked about herself. Yes, I asked her questions about herself. She told me her name was Daisy Renton, that she'd lost both parents, that she came originally from somewhere outside Brumley. She also told me she had a job in one of the works here and had to leave after a strike. She said something about the shop too, but wouldn't say which it was, and she was deliberately vague about what happened. I couldn't get any exact details from her about her past life. She wanted to talk about herself, just because she felt I was interested and friendly. But at the same time, she wanted to be Daisy Renton, not Eva Smith. In fact, I heard that name for the first time tonight. What she did let slip, although she didn't mean to, is that she was desperately hard up and at that moment was actually hungry. I made the people at the county find some food for her. And then you decided to keep her as your mistress? The inspector implies here that Eva has turned to drink to help her cope. Did she drink much at that time? Eva is sociable and wants to communicate openly about her life. Clear contrast then to the secretive Burlings. She also shows that she trusts Gerald and allows us to empathise with her. Gerald's words here imply manipulation and indeed interrogation. Another contrast with the other Burlings. She was interested and she felt Gerald was interested and friendly. Eva opens up to Gerald in the hope he will save her and understand. He lets her do this because she is easier to manipulate if he knows more about his victim. We get the sense this is a very one-sided conversation. Gerald's tone here is almost gleeful as he identifies a weakness he can exploit. The word desperate implies how in need of help Eva actually was. The inspector's words at the end of this page, or this extract, make clear Gerald's view of Eva as a pet or an object, rather than a person. He says to Gerald, and then you decided to keep her. Key quotes then from Act 2. You've got quite a contrast there between the way Eva is acting and the way Gerald is acting. It's quite rare that she's mentioned by name. It's always she rather than Eva or Daisy. And you notice one of the longer quotes from Gerald there in the bottom right. She had to go away and be quiet and remember just to make it last longer. This is possibly one of the saddest lines of the play, as we find out she was briefly happy with Gerald before he walked out on her because his friend's rent was up and he no longer had accommodation to keep her. Key moments then of Act 3. Before she met Mrs. Burling, we find out Eva returns to the Palace Bar and is picked up by Eric. Eric takes advantage of Eva's position and forces himself on her. She gets pregnant. And she refuses to see Eric again when she finds out he was stealing money. Look, Inspector, I give thousands, yes, thousands. You're offering money at the wrong time, Mr. Burling. No, I don't think any of you will forget, nor that young man Croft, though he did have some affection for her at least, and made her happy for a time. Well, Eva Smith's gone. You can't do her any more harm, and you can't do any good now either. You can't even say, I'm sorry, Eva Smith. That's the worst of it. Burling has lost all bravado now and offers a fortune to save Eva Smith, which shows the desperation he feels at a situation he has no control over. The inspector changes tone and is much calmer, perhaps sensing the lesson has been learnt by the Burlings. The bluntness of this statement is matter of fact and almost cold, implying the case is closed and justice has now been served. Eva Smith's gone. There is a dark humour here as the inspector treats the Burlings like children, mimicking them. You can't even say, I'm sorry, Eva Smith. And the inspector's cold, commanding tone is juxtaposed with the broken Sheila Burling, who's still reliving the horrors of the evening and empathising with Eva. The writer's purpose. Priestley was disillusioned with capitalism and believed it was the cause of suffering and devastation that Britain faced. To make his moral standpoint clear, he used the construct of Eva as a propaganda tool to exaggerate his socialist message. He uses Eva as a symbol of Christian goodness that is slowly decayed by the actions of those around her. He made her just like any other woman at the time, but also an individual so that the audience can connect with her and empathise with her fate. Lastly then, some quotes from Act 3. Please pause the video, have a bit of think about the language being used here, and of course the way these thoughts are constructed on the page. Brainstorm maybe 2 or 3 of these and think, can I actually say a lot about them? Can I identify individual word choices that are interesting for Priestley to use? The audience reactions then in 1945. What would they think of Eva Smith? The audience at the time would have had similar opinions of the working class as the Burlings. Priestley slowly builds the character of Eva Smith to make her real to the middle-class audience sat in their theatre seats in 1945. He deliberately peels back the stereotypes of that class and makes them appear foolish in order to leave the audience open to his message of socialism. We're now going to look at the 3 parts of the play, the start, the middle and the end, and we're going to look at some key quotes with full explanations next to them. As I reveal the screen, please pause it and make notes in your notebooks. From the start of the play, Priestley reveals very little about Eva, creating a feeling of mystery and a sense that this was an everyday, normal girl. As the play develops, Eva is further manipulated and taken advantage of by those of a higher class. It is through their sinister actions that we see her inner goodness and virtues more clearly as we contrast them with Mr. Gerald Croft and the remaining Burlings. By the end of the play, at the play's conclusion, the most brutal corruption of Eva's liveliness has been told. She was raped and subsequently made pregnant by Eric, and has no choice but to find a way out of the capitalist trap she's been placed in. Now we've looked at all the elements of Eva Smith's life, her timeline, key quotes to describe her, and perhaps many of the characters' reactions to her as well. It might be interesting to watch a video that proves that this is actually all one girl that the Burlings have met. Certainly Gerald believes that actually they met several different girls, but the events of the play are too convenient for that to be the case. This clip also gives some alternative interpretations that link to points raised in my other revision videos. If you don't want to wait 20 minutes, then hit the fast forward button, which increases the speed of this talk through, so you get the general highlights, but aren't necessarily sitting there for 20 minutes listening, although some of the ideas in this clip really are very clever.
Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the really top grades. Today's top 10 is looking at Eva's timeline. And the reason this is important is Gerald spends so long in Act 3 trying to prove that everything that happened to Eva might in fact have happened to 5 different girls based on the inspector showing them different photographs. And therefore the inspector, according to Gerald, has just made up a person out of actions that the Burlings and Gerald have committed to different girls. Now, Sheila's point is that actually it makes no difference whether they're different girls or not. What matters is the evil intent or the consequences of those actions. But Priestley also sets this up to prove that Gerald is utterly and completely wrong. There are not loads of separate girls, there is only one girl. And I'm going to use the timeline to prove that. So if we follow through Eva's history, we can see that it cannot have been loads of different girls unless some sort of miracle of coincidence is going on. So fact number 1, Eva is sacked from Burling's in the last week of September 1910. This girl left us nearly 2 years ago, says Burling. Let me see, it must have been in the early autumn of 1910. Yes, says the inspector, end of September 1910. Now we know the inspector isn't lying here because he's shown the photograph to Burling and Burling remembers her. So we know this first instance must be true, and then all other dates will follow from this confirmed fact. Next, we find out that after 2 months of unemployment, Eva is employed at Millwall's, the department store, and this is the beginning of December 1910. And it happened that at the beginning of December that year, 1910, there was a good deal of influenza about, and Millwall's suddenly found themselves short-handed. Now, this is a crucial bit of information because it tells us how incredibly lucky Eva was to get the job, and it tells us 2 terrible things about the economy at the time. Number 1, your job was not protected if you got the flu. So if you got the flu and you were unable to work for a month, you could very easily get sacked. You didn't have proper employment rights. And, that's something that Priestley is campaigning about. But it also hints at something much worse than that, and that is the life expectancy of workers. Because very often influenza was fatal because there were no antibiotics in those days, and consequently Eva getting the job could well be dependent on somebody having died. So here Priestley's suggesting that an employee depends on the misfortune of others in order to be able to succeed themselves. The capitalist system is therefore inherently unfair. Next, we discovered that from January to February 1911, she worked at Millwall's until she was sacked. Now, this date has to agree exactly with what Sheila has done. So we know that the girl who gets sacked from Millwall's has to be the same one who got sacked from Burling's. Unless the inspector just got incredibly lucky and found out that Sheila had someone sacked, but that sacking occurred after Eva had been sacked rather than before. And the other problem is because Sheila is a regular at Millwall's, because her parents have an account there after all, this is the place to go for clothing, and that's what women do in this play, at least according to Mr. Burling, she would know the employees. So if she'd sacked someone who'd been there for more than 2 months, the inspector wouldn't have been able to pretend that she was there only 2 months. And consequently, the dates have to fit the story, and it's highly, highly unlikely that this could have been a different girl. Now, the other thing that Priestley wants to emphasise here is that the girl was settling down nicely. She was doing a really good job. And that echoes what Burling said about her. She was doing a really good job at Burling's, and in fact they were going to promote her. Because Priestley is pointing out that in a proper capitalist system, where the market decides, based on your profitability, how much you'll get paid, then someone who's good at their job would be able to not only remain in employment, but earn more. Whereas here, because of the nature of the business owners, the Burlings here, the capitalist system is not working properly. They are not being paid a level that fits with how useful they are. So she should have remained employed by Millward's, but she got sacked, and she should have remained employed by Burling's, but she got sacked. The capitalist system is not working properly. And it's worth bearing this in mind, because Priestley isn't arguing for the country to overturn capitalism. He's asking for capitalism with a moral conscience. And it's the moral conscience that he says is lacking in these business owners and the rich. Now the dates coincide again. March and April to September 1911, Eva meets Gerald at the Palace Bar, the theatre, and becomes his mistress. Now again, Gerald knows these dates, so it would be highly unlikely that he's just suddenly found a mistress that coincidentally has these dates. And remember, this is super important, all the characters describe what Eva is like in personality. She seemed like a good sport, and they all describe what she looks like physically. Dark hair or brown hair and dark eyes and very pretty. And so what we have here is also not just random girls, but girls who look like each other, matching on the same days. And that would be really unlikely for that to be separate girls. So were you seeing her last spring and summer? During that time you hardly came near me, asks Eva, and that completely matches the length of the affair that Gerald has, and it also matches with what's going to happen with Eva next when she meets Eric. So next, Gerald rejects Eva in the first week of September 1911. This is another crucial date because it's the date that Gerald's friend gets back from Canada, and it shows us that Gerald has got no reason to get rid of Eva. She's still, from his point of view, his mistress. The only reason he gets rid of her is that she'll suddenly start to cost him money. At the minute, she's living in the friend's flat for free. Gerald's paying nothing. He pays Eva very little. But as soon as the friend comes back and Gerald would have to find another flat for her to live in, he would then have to pay for that flat. Suddenly Eva is not worth the money. Now, you probably haven't thought of this, but if Gerald had used a prostitute during this time, that would have been significantly more expensive than having Eva as a mistress, not having to pay any rent and just giving her a little bit of money to live on and to save. So Priestley does this to show us that Eva's fate is even worse than that of a prostitute, because he pays her even less. He completely exploits her, but he pretends he does it out of a desire to help and out of affection. And then when we look at Gerald's words here, I can tell you exactly, in the first week of September, you can see why he's got rid of her. It coincides exactly with his friend coming back. He's utterly, utterly callous, and Priestley does this to symbolise how rich men treat women. It is a callous contract. The other point that he's making is Gerald's marriage to Sheila is also not a love match. It is also a similar contract. And what he's doing here is implying that for Gerald, one of the main reasons to marry is going to be the alliance of the two businesses. And at the end of the play, the Burlings are still really keen for Gerald to marry Sheila, even though he's confessed to having an affair, because for them the most important thing is also that contract, the business alliance. They're going to not just remain rich, but grow richer and form a family dynasty of wealth down through the generations. And that's much more important to them than love, and Priestley wants us to find that horrifying. Now, the other bit of information that we need to consider is that the inspector didn't know about Gerald's affair with Daisy in advance. This is something of a surprise to him. He only asked Gerald to stay once he finds out that Gerald is going to become part of the family, that he's going to marry Sheila. He doesn't know what Gerald has done. Therefore, he can't anticipate that the woman that Gerald has had an affair with is in fact Eva. He doesn't know that in advance. But the fact that these dates fit so exactly again point to this being actual fact and not the inspector just manipulating them into believing that several girls were the same one they all had an effect on. Now we have to ask, why does Priestley do this? Well, he's trying to undermine Gerald's escape route, Gerald's desire to deny what he's been involved with. And the reason for that is he wants to show that this denial is a natural state for the upper classes. And he's making a wider point. The only way you can still keep faith in capitalism in its current form is to be in a state of denial about how it exploits people and actually ruins their lives. And so his play is trying to, if you like, take away the blindfold that the upper classes put on themselves and let them see the world and themselves as they really are. Now the inspector says that Eva went away to the seaside with the little money that she'd saved, and again Gerald confirms that he gave her some extra money, so that exactly ties in with what Gerald says. And remember, the inspector couldn't know in advance that Gerald had given her the money. That coincides exactly with when Eric met her in November. Now again, he doesn't know in advance that it was in November that Eric met Eva. He only knows about Eric's relationship with Eva and that he is the father of her child. So the inspector doesn't know all these dates in advance and therefore can't make sure that he has a plausible number of girls who would fit the timeline. Far from it, this must be the same girl. Then we have this bizarre courtship between Eric and Eva, which was late November or December 1911. Eva begins a relationship with Eric. Now, you have to take a view on whether Eric's description of how they first had sex is actually an account of rape or not, whether he's forced himself on her. But then this idea that then arranged to see each other is truly horrifying, because whether or not it was rape, he was certainly using his physical power as well as his wealth to convince Eva to let him in and have sex with her. And so this relationship is one which begins with him exploiting her. Now, you possibly haven't considered why Eva commits suicide by drinking bleach. And remember, this bleach doesn't just kill her, it kills her unborn baby. Well, bleach is a symbol of cleansing. She wants to cleanse herself, and what's been inside her, what's been in her inside, it's Eric. So this strongly suggests that he has raped Eva, and she's only with him out of economic necessity, but is in the end too disgusted with having to make this compromise and kills herself. And more importantly, she doesn't wait until she's given birth to do that. She wants to kill her baby as well. Why? Because it is Eric's baby, and he is the person who's raped her, and therefore she cannot bear the fact of this child coming into the world. It's horrific. Now, Priestley never spells this out to us. He demands that we use our inference and intelligence to work this out for ourselves. So we know Eva is pregnant in December, and we know that by February or March 1912, Eva gets money from Eric, and he confesses it's about £50 all told. Now, at this stage, she doesn't commit suicide because she doesn't know that the money is stolen. And she's waiting to see if she can live with this compromise, this terrible compromise she's had to make of still being in a relationship with the man who has got her pregnant and has probably raped her in order to do so. She's obviously tried to forgive him because he was drunk, and she's obviously tried to forgive him because she needs the money. And this is an extraordinary amount of money. It's actually at least half a year's wages that he's given her. And that presents a bit of a mystery, because in April she goes to look for charity. And so actually this £50, we can infer Eric doesn't give entirely to Eva at all. He must be spending a lot of it on himself. So in April we find out that 2 weeks ago she's gone to the Bromley Women's Charity Organisation, and we know that sometime before that she split with Eric because she found out he was stealing money. So she can't have split with him any earlier than February and no later than March. This again exactly fits the timeline. And again, if he's met her in November, we can see that she's spending money really quickly in order to run out in March. So it's only November, December, January, February. It's only 4 months, and she's already spent over 6 months' worth of wages. And this wouldn't make sense to an audience in 1945. They ought to be able to work out that there's something fishy going on here, and that Eric is probably pocketing the extra money that he's stolen. And this could be another reason why she chooses not to marry him. Now, she dies at a really significant time. So she dies in the first week in April 1912, and she commits suicide. How close to April Fool's Day must that be? Spring is symbolic of new beginnings, and of course the opposite is true for Eva. She's committed suicide. It's an ending, it's not a new beginning at all. However, the new beginning is also coming from her tragedy. And when he writes this play, Priestley is trying to suggest that this moment in 1912 could be the new beginning of when the upper classes start to lose their grip on power. And he wants that to come to fruition in 1945, which in fact it does, because the Conservative government is defeated, and we have a landslide victory for the Labour Party, which is on the side of the common working man and working woman. 1912 is also really significant because it's at the height of the suffragette movement, where women are campaigning for the vote for the first time. Astonishingly, women weren't allowed to vote in an election at all. They simply had no voice, which we can see in the female characters in the play. So, Sheila has to marry Gerald if she wants to get away from her family, and Eva is totally exploited by all the Burlings, and in particular the men, especially Gerald and Eric, who use her for sex and abuse her financially as well. And one historical reference that Priestley is determined to use is the idea of the Titanic, which sails next week, and of course he tells us that it's utterly unsinkable. So the Titanic set sail on the 10th of April, and this marks the end, symbolically, of upper-class supremacy. Obviously, it was it was from Burling's point of view, it was the super-rich who went on the maiden voyage, and many of those, of course, were drowned, and so this is a symbol of how the upper classes are reaching a turning point, and they're being exterminated, if you like, by nature. And at the same time, many more working class passengers were killed because they were on the lower decks because of the class system. And again, it's another symbol about how the upper classes exploit the working classes, so the working classes suffer more. Now, this is the only date that doesn't quite fit, because when Burling rings up the infirmary, when Gerald rings up the infirmary, he finds that no one has committed suicide, and so it all looks like a fiction. But then the final curtain arrives with the second phone call. It's the police coming, because there has been a suicide. So what we've seen is Eva's timeline exactly matches, and it would be almost impossible to find different girls who have played each part and still have their appearance and character match Eva's, and consequently we know that the attempt to persuade themselves that this is not the same girl is entirely self-deception, and that self-deception is a wider symbol about what's wrong with the upper classes. They are deceiving themselves about the appalling consequences of their actions on the working class. And Priestley kind of top and tails this in the play with alluding straight away to the tragedy of those thousands of deaths on the Titanic, and then at the end of the play with the new suicide, apparently, of Eva Smith. So you're now in a position to be able to use these facts in a discussion of every single character. Burling, Mrs. Burling, Eric, Sheila, obviously Eva, and the inspector. You've revised all those characters just by looking at this 10-point timeline. So I hope your revision is going super well and that you will stay tuned for the next video. Don't forget to subscribe.
As that clip mentioned then, it's quite important that Eva Smith commits suicide by drinking disinfectant. So why did Priestley choose disinfectant? She was cleansing herself of corruption. Is this simply a painful and tortured death of a martyr, someone sacrificing herself for a greater good? Or is it a metaphor for the violation of her body by Eric? She wants to cleanse herself and wash herself free of Eric and Eric's unborn son or daughter. Some key quotes then to help us remember Eva Smith and many of the other characters too.
And harder, the Germans don't want war. You turned her away, yes, and you killed her. We are members of one body, we are responsible for each other. Pink and intimate, brighter and harder, the Germans don't want war. You turned her away, yes, and you killed her. We are members of one body, we are responsible for each other. Pink and intimate, brighter and harder, the Germans don't want war. You turned her away, yes, and you killed her. We are members of one body, we are responsible for each other. Pink and intimate, brighter and harder, the Germans don't want war. You turned her away, yes, and you killed her. We are members of one body, we are responsible for each other. Pink and intimate, brighter and harder, the Germans don't want war. You turned her away, yes, and you killed her. We are members of one body, we are responsible for each other. One more time. Pink and intimate, brighter and harder, the Germans don't want war. You turned her away, yes, and you killed her. We are members of one body, we are responsible for each other.
Hope you found that useful, guys. Hope it's stuck in your head, ready for the exam.
Now let's move on then to the essay guidance. Remember, this is a morality play. It's trying to teach us the message of socialism. None of the characters are real. They are simply constructs built to represent different parts of society. In Eva's case, you need to know all the other characters as she never appears on stage. It is through their reaction to her that we understand her character. So if you're asked about Eva Smith in the exam, you're actually going to be talking about all the other characters in the play. Now this is a make or break skill, analysing a quote. You can see in red on the mark scheme there how important it is to simply pass the test. You've got to zoom in or focus on a detail of one particular quote. But some students seem to think that using just part of a quote in a sentence is enough. No, you have to explain why that exact word is used to the best of your ability. Let's take a look at this quote here then. Lively, good-looking girl, good worker too. You could tell me, that, or the examiner, that Eva Smith is a pretty girl. The quote, lively, good-looking girl, suggests she is pretty. Well, no. That quote doesn't suggest she's pretty. The words there are much more specific than that. We need to think what exactly is meant by lively. Why is she referred to as being good-looking? And perhaps why is she referred to as being a girl? Why does Priestley choose that exact word or those exact words to tell us information about her? Telling me she's just pretty based on that is something like a grade 3 or maybe even a grade 2. This is what the answer might well look like instead. Eva Smith is an attractive girl, the point before the quote. The quote, lively, good-looking girl, suggests that she is fun to be around. The word lively suggests he's full of energy and enjoying life. This is much more like what analysing a quote would look like. We look at a longer quote, lively, good-looking girl, and then select one word from it to explain in more depth. In this case, lively is probably the best word to analyse from that quote. This, though, might be a much stronger response. Many characters remark on Eva's looks as they see her as a commodity or an object rather than a living, breathing person. The phrase, lively, good-looking girl, challenges us to accept Eva as opposite to the Burlings. Adjectives such as lively offer us an image of a beautiful girl who is full of energy and vitality of life. The noun girl exaggerates this even further as it adds a sense of innocence and youth that was destroyed by the Burlings. 2 words analysed there, and some really clever, or not so clever, but certainly there, links to the reader. I've used words like us, we are reminded of, this makes us think about, challenges us, all links to the reader, or myself in this case, making sure the examiner knows that I've really thought about the character and what I think Priestley's trying to tell me given his word choices. I've selected 2 words from this quote for this higher grade because I thought actually the word girl is, or the noun girl, is equally important to this quote, and that tells me quite a bit of detail about the Burlings' perception of her. This is a quote then from another character. I made her take some money to keep her going there. I made her suggest force or aggression. It implies then that she was forced into something she didn't want to do. I made her take some money to keep her going there. This will be Eric speaking then. Notice he doesn't use her name. He calls her instead. Perhaps he doesn't want to admit that she's a real person. To keep her going implies that he's objectifying her, as if she's an object that he's just keeping moving, like a car perhaps, or some new invention in 1912. This then reveals her character, or his character, forcing women around and treating her like an object. One Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, is a quote from the inspector himself. We've got exaggeration there of how many different workers there are through the repetition of millions, millions and millions. We're supposed to reflect on exactly how many Eva Smiths there are compared with the upper class. And then at the end of the quote, John Smith still left with us being representative of the Burlings, Gerald and the inspector. He's reminding us that although we all come from different backgrounds, we still have a responsibility, a socialist responsibility, to look after those around us who might be more in need than we are. Now we're going to look at the essay in response to the question, how important is the character of Eva Smith in Inspector Calls? Be a good idea to pause the video at this point and plan your essay, then compare with the one you're about to see and see what similarities and differences there are. We start then with an opening introduction to this question. I immediately mention the writer in my first sentence. Priestley uses political diatribe to critique the 1912 society of capitalism. The play is allegorical, and Priestley specifically uses Eva Smith to show the widespread cruel treatment of the upper classes. This is used to show how destructive capitalism is to society and how the working classes most predominantly fall victim. This then is paragraph 2. Through Eric, Priestley represents the exploitative attitudes of upper-class men. The description, this is our quote then, when a chap easily turns nasty, portrays the instability and cruelty of Edwardian society. The use of the determiner when suggests that Eric's abusive behaviour is almost casual and the expectation for men of the era. His behaviour goes unchallenged, which reflects the distorted and cruel actions of upper-class men. Priestley emphasises this through the noun chaps, which he used to connote the gentry and upper-class men of England, those who the audience accept the highest moral standards from. The adverb easily presents the cruelty of these men, as it implies naturally they're inclined towards the mistreatment of women. However, usually when in business, they conceal it behind layers of increasing profits and enterprise. However, Priestley implies the men of the upper class Edwardian society are raised to be wicked and cruel. Their sense of superiority is so profound. Priestley does this to show the effect of capitalist society, as those who succeed in it are usually from the abuse of others. It highlights the destruction of society and enables Priestley to advocate a kinder society. Now this is quite a good answer. You'll notice there are some sort of slight typos here and there, I would also query how many quotes this response actually uses. Certainly it analyses, it looks at the word chap, then easily, and you could easily add on there an analysis of the word nasty, what it means when a chap turns nasty. There is definitely analysis here, and it begins to link to the history of the time, the mistreatment of women, and the role the upper class should play when looking after those lower than themselves. It's not perfect, as I said, I'd probably use more quotes in my response than this, but there is no doubt this is an excellent example of analysis. My middle paragraph immediately starts with moreover, suggesting then that the theme or the character of Eva Smith is explored in more depth the longer the play goes on for. Once more, the word Priestley, the link to the writer, appears quite regularly. Moreover, Priestley shows how Eva Smith is dehumanised, lovely word that, a dehumanised Eva Smith, through the lack of care for her life and suicide. Then we've got a link, of course, to Daisy, which I was earlier in this clip, why the name Daisy is important. The noun daisy connotes a summer flower, beauty and a sense of innocence, undamaged by the world. It is a symbol of new life and is hopeful, which echoes Eva's position at the start of the play. She is young and desires a more prosperous future. I like the reference in that line to the start of the play. This shows the examiner then, this candidate has a full understanding of the whole play itself, not just the key page they were given in the exam. Priestley creates an oxymoron with Renton, which seems to stem from the word rent, which means to make a payment. Through this phrase, Priestley connotes exploitation and abuse. Again, really nice wording there. Priestley connotes exploitation and abuse. Paired with the semantic field of business and industrial language, business install her, Priestley can portray Gerald's exploitative and destructive attitude to women. Gerald sees these women as only functionaries for him to gain wealth and enjoy pleasure, and he feels the right to use and abuse them for this. This shows deep understanding of the character of Gerald, as well as Priestley's intentions when creating the play itself. The phrase semantic field of business shows the exam board that this candidate really understands how all the words link together, that there are certain words and phrases that both Burling and Gerald use that link to the same aim, in this case, capitalist business. Once more, we look at wonderful word choices, using these women only as functionaries, implying then that Gerald only uses and abuses women and sees them as just a function or a thing that he can use when he wants to and discard when he needs to. The last paragraph. Gerald uses the adjective fresh to describe Eva. This could connote an affection for Eva as she was young and Gerald enjoyed their company. Notice this candidate is focusing a lot on Gerald. The candidate clearly thinks that this is a really good character to focus on, simply because Gerald describes Eva the most, so there's much more to say about Gerald and Eva than there is perhaps Eric and Eva. It seems more keeping with Priestley's message, however, that Gerald sees Eva's young life as something he can abuse and destroy. At the end of the play, Eva has lost her innocence through her death. Priestley highlights Eva's youth and vulnerability, which Gerald seems to enjoy abusing and taking away from her. Priestley's initial use of flower imagery to describe Eva suggests her death as a result of collective cruelty, wonderful phrase, collective cruelty, of the Burlings, symbolic of upper-class England and capitalist society. She has destroyed, deflowered a hope, and a hopeful young life has ended. Priestley uses exploitative, cruel nature of capitalism and how the savage attitudes of business have spread through the social attitudes of life. This candidate clearly understands Priestley's aim and has thought long and hard about how this might be worded in the exam. We got yet again a reference to the end of the play, so in total now we have the beginning, the middle and the end, and a lovely introduction to start off with. If I was to now reread that entire essay, what I'd want to do is make a note of the quotes being used and the particularly good words being used and put those down on a sheet of paper, forming in effect a set of instructions for how to write this response. What I'd do from there is try and write the same essay based on the notes I made. I would then replay this video and see how close my essay was compared with the one on the screen. This essay is taken from a website, so it should be easy to find online if you type in some of the words or sentences from it. Thank you very much then for listening to this recording, or this revision recording, for Eva Smith and of course her alter ego, Daisy Renton. This is a guide to your GCSE post-1914 drama.